Hello and welcome to another Times Radio Members Question and Answer. Today we're answering comments and questions from our channel members on frontline episodes and other videos about the war in Ukraine and its impact on the world stage. I'm Philip Ingram. I currently present Times Radio Frontline, but I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and I commentate on most things geopolitical, military, security and anything else that people ask me to. Now, getting straight into the questions, our first question today comes from Walter. And Walter, you say, any Putin-Kremlin ties in the Pakistan and India conflict? Well, of course, we've had the Indians attacking terror camps in Pakistan, and we're waiting the Pakistani response. The Pakistanis intercepted a number of Indian aircraft and shot them down, and therefore tensions are going through the roof. There's nothing that formally tells me that the Kremlin has got ties into Pakistan and India and are stirring things up, but it's the sort of thing that keeps Vladimir Putin off the headline news and causes the international community to focus some of its efforts into that and therefore away from dealing with Vladimir Putin. So it wouldn't surprise me if at some stage in the future we see something emerging where there's been a little bit of Russian disinformation on both sides to try and amplify the differences and amplify the issues. I don't think the Kremlin were behind the Pakistani militant attack in India that led up to this. But again, it's difficult to assess. It's the sort of thing the Russians would want to do. But I think historically, relations between India and Pakistan, especially in the Kashmiri region, have always been tense, and these sorts of things tend to bubble up. The good thing is we're hearing de-escalatory language at the moment from both sides, so I don't think it's going to blow up into anything massive, metaphorically and literally speaking, I hope. Next point comes from Marty. Marty, you say, let's see how fast the Russian cookie crumbles once they have to start planning finances for 2026. I think you might have been reading UK Defence Intelligence daily update that I think was put out on Thursday, put out yesterday actually, and that talks about the impact that the oil price is having on the Russian economy. I think we're down to $53 a barrel for Urals oil, and the Russian economy is being hit quite hard with what it's spending on defence, and its income's not coming in. There's a lot of talk about the Russian economy crumbling. If you go back into some of the frontline episodes this week and have a little look, I've talked that through with certainly Bill Browder. We talked a lot on the economy in frontline episode yesterday. So there's some really good commentary, not just from me on that, but yes, pressure is on Vladimir Putin at the moment. The 2026 budget is going to be very interesting, especially if the oil price stays low or gets lower. But Russia is still making huge amounts of money from its oil exports. Paddy, you come in with the next point and say, surely Russia has lost the war. Equally important, it will take Russia longer to rebuild an offensive capability that will take Europe to rearm. Has Ukraine saved Europe, even if they end up losing the ground that's been occupied? A number of points in there. Has Russia lost the war? Answer, yes. Vladimir Putin has failed to achieve his strategic goals. His strategic goals were the toppling of the Zelensky government, the installation of a puppet regime so that Ukraine would turn into a Belarus equivalent and a puppet to Russia. That's never going to happen now. Putin has lost that. He still thinks he can get there, but the reality is he's not done that. So he's gone for his secondary objectives, which is the disputed Donbass. And again, he's missed an opportunity. The Americans were almost giving him the whole of Donbass, and he's turned around and said, no, I want more. And the Americans have now turned on him. If there's any territory that Ukraine, in inverted commas, loses, it will be done, I think, in a way that there'll be a temporary loss, in the same way that Germany was temporarily split at the end of the Second World War. And this is part of the Zelensky plan. Zelensky realizes he can't take the territory back militarily. But Russia has lost. And of course, their wider grand strategic objectives was to stop the expansion of NATO. Well, there's two new countries have joined NATO, and therefore Putin has become an international pariah, and the implications of that on Putin's wider foreign policy. We've seen him effectively pushed out of the Middle East and therefore the Mediterranean. That's impacting his presence in Africa. Putin's not in a good state at the moment. So as long as Ukraine can keep the pressure up and as long as the international community stays together, then I think there could be some surprises coming up in the not too distant future. It's not going to happen this year. It may happen next year, but certainly the year after will be something that's interesting if the war is still continuing. So next, we've got Andrew. And Andrew, I think you've got a number of points and questions today. You say, Philip, it looks from the coverage that you've seen that at this stage, Russians have almost given up using tanks in the front line. I presume this is because of the vulnerability of all but the most modern tanks to attack by drones, because the Russian losses, they're reduced to using tanks from the 50s and 60s era. Do you think this is correct? I don't think the Russians have all but given up using tanks because tactics have changed and everything else. I don't think the Russians use their tanks tactically in a very efficient way to begin with, because fighting an all-arms battle where you're using your tanks supported by armoured infantry, supported by armoured artillery, supported with armoured engineers under an air and aviation umbrella is what's called the all-arms and the combined arms battle. The Russians have that in theory in their doctrine. They've never prosecuted it. And this is where tactics from small groups of determined men with javelin or NLAW missiles had such a devastating effect on the battlefield to start with. And a lot of Russia's experienced tank crews and tank commanders and tactical commanders who understand proper tank warfare have now been killed. And that's why you've got inexperience coming through. So the Russians are using their tanks almost as just mobile big guns. And this is where the Ukrainian drones are managing to pick them off, because tanks aren't being used the way tanks should be used as part of a combined arms formation. And that's where the vulnerability comes in. And we're seeing the 50s and 60s tanks coming through because Russia's running out of them, effectively. They keep saying that they're producing numbers. They're only producing tens of new tanks out of their manufacturing capability every year. What they've been doing is taking huge numbers that they had in storage sites across Russia, refurbishing them and getting them back out to the front line as quickly as possible. But there's certain natures that they can't refurbish. There's certain natures where their engines came from Ukraine. Ukraine's not supplying engines back to Russia again, and components come from all over the world. So the sanctions are biting Russia and stopping Russia's ability to refurbish tanks. But again, their losses are so much that they've just run out of stock. And we're starting to see certain armoured natures coming from North Korea. That shows just what a bad position Russia is in. So, Andrew, your next question is, what do you think the state of Russian artillery? I imagine the barrels and artillery pieces have fairly short life in the conditions, with the conditions we see in Ukraine. North Korea has been supplying shells. Is it also supplying barrels and artillery pieces? Answer, yes. Russia, it's the one thing that I have seen is large numbers of North Korean artillery pieces at the higher calibers, so 152 millimeter calibers coming into Russia, because clearly Russia has not got the ability to sustain its artillery, the losses of its artillery systems. And we're seeing rocket systems coming in as well. That shows the state that Russia's in. But I imagine it's the same with not just artillery barrels, but tank barrels as well. And that's probably another reason why they're not using their tanks. Of course, in the UK, we shouldn't be sitting looking at this with glee, because we've only just started a capability in this country to manufacture artillery and tank barrels ourselves. We lost that for many years because our artillery pieces and our tanks were only ever used in training. And Andrew, your third point is, I do think the minerals agreement has some deterrent potential from future Russian attack. However, in the scenario that if Putin reassured Trump or the next president that American mining interests would not be harmed in a future invasion, quite the contrary, Putin would offer America 75% of future profits. Do you think America would simply step back and not interfere with the invasion? I personally think the minerals agreement is it's not really worth the paper it's written on from a security perspective. Most of the minerals are in parts of the territory that are either under Russian control, but even whether it's under Russian control or Ukrainian control at the moment, they haven't been exploited yet. There's millions of dollars that's going to have to be spent to build the mines up to start to exploit them. So this is based on theoretical or assessed areas of where these minerals are, and is something that Trump can say, I've got down payments for the future against the support that we'll give Ukraine. And of course, there were American companies in Ukraine back in 2022 when the Russians invaded. We had American companies in Kuwait whenever the Iraqis invaded Kuwait. So this deterrence argument that American boots on the ground are going to deter anyone, or American personnel on the ground are going to deter anyone from attacking in, I think is fundamentally flawed. So whether Putin would do that, I don't know. Whether an American government would allow Putin to just come in again, probably not. But Trump is all about the art of the deal, and we're dealing with someone who is exceptionally unpredictable. But he's only in office for the next 4 and a bit years. So, final question comes from Cecil, and you say, "Sky Shield for Ukraine now. Why is Europe dragging its feet over 3 years into Russia's genocide?" Yes, closing the skies to the threats that are coming in through them is something that we could do. We haven't got the missile capability to do that, to provide that sky shield in the same way that Israel's got, because Israel is geographically so much smaller, and it's invested in its capability for so many years. Ukraine is massive. And therefore, to have any effect, we'd need to bring our air forces together into effectively bring in a no-fly zone, whether that be for fixed-wing aircraft, for missiles, for drones, or anything else. As soon as we do that, that will bring NATO forces into direct conflict with the Russians. That's an escalatory factor at the moment. But your sentiment is right. We have been dragging our feet too much. So thank you for bringing that up. So thank all of you for watching this week's question and answer, and for posting your questions. Remember, if you want access to exclusive videos and have your questions answered, please sign up for Time Zero membership.